Hello and welcome to Presence. I'm Doug King. I really appreciate you joining me in this fourth section of an overview on integral theology. For whatever reason, if you're here in the fourth section, let me express my thanks to you. Perhaps you have a sleeping problem. Perhaps you are a person that is looking for good material to present to your religion on the appearance of the Antichrist on the planet. Or perhaps you are actually trying to follow us in our thinking trajectory. But whatever the reason, hey, thanks for joining me in this fourth section and hanging in there with me. And I believe for most people, it's the foundational material I've been going through at the very first is a little bit more difficult to follow. Frankly, a lot of the things that pertain to the Hebrew writings are not things within Christianity that a lot of people, pastors and churches actually read and study, not to denigrate that, but to say that a lot of the focus obviously in Christianity is Christ, and that means there's a focus on the Gospels and the apostolic writings. So we have been going through the Hebrew writings. Why? Because we're using the spiral dynamic principles that begin with archaic and go forward. And so, as you know, in these previous sections, we talked about the genesis of consciousness with Adam and Abraham and how that was formed, how it relates to spiral dynamics. So, for example, Father Abraham and spiral dynamics are beautifully integrated because God made a promise to Abraham. And what was that? What were those promises? He said, I will make of you a great nation, singular. Then the second part of the promises to Abraham was, through you, Father Abraham, I'm going to bless all the nations of the earth. So, when you talk about the first tier promise, first tier, using spiral dynamics, I will make of you, Abraham, a great nation. Well, that was the nation of Israel, and that applied to boundary-driven identity. What was Israel? Israel was an entity that literally had land boundaries. Now, does attachment to form create problems? Let's think about the current day in the nation of Israel in the Middle East. Are there any disputes over land boundaries? So we can see that attachment to form can lead to a lot of problems. So for Father Abraham, tier one, I'll make of you a great nation. But the ultimate fulfillment through Abraham that God was doing as source was, through you, Father Abraham, I will bless all the nations of the earth. This is what we understand to be second tier and formlessness. Why formlessness? Because the boundaries are removed. God is showing, look, as human beings, you may have roles and functions and cultures and ethnicities that show themselves as a rich variety in that sense. But the blessing of all the nations is God evolving spiritual consciousness so that we can come to the realization that there are no boundaries between us, regardless of all of our cultural or ethnic or any other type of identifiers that have through history caused one group to see themselves as superior or one group to try to dominate or cause violence upon another. That's always at the core of our human existence. So that's what we're trying to do when we look at this. And so we move from Abraham, we talked about Moses in this last section and the reason why you have commandments and how those commandments were actually an increase of self-doing over what began with Adam in the first place. And now today I want to talk a little bit about David because David is another major figure in the narrative. In fact, as we move from form to transform and the work of Jesus in transform, what is it that Jesus is transforming? Well, you've got archaic Adam. So Jesus transforms every level, every archetype in the system. Adam is an archetype, Abraham's an archetype, Moses is an archetype, David is an archetype. Jesus is an archetype of transformation, meaning that you have Adam, in Adam through self, all die. in Jesus all are made alive. That's Jesus transforming Adam. In fact, Jesus is called the last Adam. Why? Well, you can't be the last of something unless you're identical with that something. Jesus of Nazareth, the man, had a higher consciousness level of God than Adam, the man. And we know from the narrative that Adam was called the Son of God. When Luke traced the genealogy of Jesus, he went back to Adam, who was called the Son of God, just as Jesus was called the Son of God. But the Son of God, which just means God's children as humans, had the Adam level of consciousness at the beginning, archaic, and it was transformed. The same is true of Abraham, from faith to faith, from the faith of Abraham to the faith of Jesus. Abraham went out into a place not knowing where he was going. The faith of Jesus was that through the cross, he was going to go and prepare a place. And he knew what the place would be. It would be a place of spiritual understanding through his work that manifested in history, that everyone could understand regarding putting away the self, and that he could then receive all humanity there. I will come again so that I can receive you where I am also. And so we have these transformative things happening in Jesus. Jesus will transform Moses. In fact, we get to the book of Revelation. It's said there by John that there was this great group, this great throng of people, and they were singing the song of Moses and the Lamb. Well, here you have a song that includes first-tier Moses and then transformative work of Jesus. It wasn't a song that separated the two. It was the song of Jesus, of Moses and the Lamb. Words and music would have been by God, because God is the source. So we're saying that there's this trajectory that's a spiral trajectory that builds. When we get to David, David, of course, is known for kingship. King David. Israel had decided on her own that she wanted to be like all the other nations. This is what happened in every culture. What did every culture have? They had kingdoms and they had kings. And then they had those that served in the armies, and all the structures were in place, and Israel was simply, through mimetics, trying to be exactly like all the other nations. So she wanted to have a king. In the biblical narrative, for those of you that are coming from integral theory, in the biblical narrative, there was a prophet named Samuel who was very disturbed that Israel was asking for a king, but he had a vision where he heard the voice of God in the vision saying, don't be disturbed by this. It's basically all in the plan of what's necessary for the evolution of spiritual consciousness. Why was it then that Israel asking for a king, or perhaps I should ask, how was it that that had anything to do with Adam? Remember, in Adam, Adam wanted to be like God. So why? Self-control, self-rule. What did Israel want to do? She wanted rule. She wanted kingship. She wanted the power. And power was always defined in a first-tier consciousness where I dominate you. And so Israel wanted to have her position of dominance among the other nations. And so in doing that, with regard to spiritual consciousness, she was just amplifying what had already begun in the mind of archaic Adam. And David was the first in a long line of kings. Now, oftentimes I've heard people refer to the statements in the book of Revelation that have to do with Jesus, where he's called the King of Kings. And oftentimes that can be used in Christianity as a way of saying Jesus trumps all other religions, or Jesus trumps all political powers, and Jesus is basically made a power figure. But if we remember that Jesus said, look, I didn't come to start something new. I didn't come to disembody myself from Moses. I came to fulfill the law and the prophets. If we remember that Jesus saw the law and the prophets as necessary and he was bringing them to a fuller stage and a better understanding for everyone, then wouldn't it seem very likely that Jesus was the king of all Davidic kings? See, the lineage of David went all the way down until the Babylonian period of time, and then when the Babylonians captured Israel, that put an end to their king. when you find them, in the first century. The Romans are there. They're sure not going to let Israel have a king. So what is it that makes Jesus the King of Kings? Well, it's his relationship to David. Remember, he was a direct descendant of David. And so he did something that none of the Davidic kings could do. He delivered Israel from her greatest Goliath. While David, on the one hand, killed Goliath in the political sense, in the autonomous sense of a nation, Jesus was going to destroy an enemy that had been around since Adam and that didn't just affect Israel. Jesus was destroying the enemy of death. And so Jesus becomes the King of Kings. How? Through a dominating, power-driven system? No. Jesus becomes the King of Kings through the sacrifice and giving up of self, which could only be done through faith, which always points to spirituality, which is always the innate nature of the human in our highest consciousness. So we're seeing these things evolve, and of course they include David, and that means that Jesus transforms kingship from a power system, from a dominating system, from a system that's based on male versus female, based on genealogy, biology, based on land, based on all external form. Jesus is dying to all external form, and David is just another way of showing how Jesus transforms that way of consciousness. So when we move through these various characters, one other note I might stop and make here is just this. When we're talking on the integral theory side, we talk in terms of the concept of holons. Holons are individual things that make up a whole called a holarchy. And the holon is just a part of the holarchy, but yet the holon is a thing in and of itself. If, for example, I have an atom, A-T-O-M, that atom is made up of electrons, protons, neutrons. An electron is a thing in and of itself, but so it is a holon. The atom is the holarchy. So it is a thing in and of itself. Adam was a thing, a level of thinking in and of himself. Abraham, Moses, David. You see, all of these are a thing in and of themselves. And even Jesus. Jesus is the last holon. He is the transformative holon. What is holarchy? Holarchy is God. You see, Jesus pointed away from himself to God as the source of all things, just like Moses did, just like Abraham, etc. This is where we understand that each of these people in the narrative, they play a role and they're holons, but God is holarchy. The in the beginning God who created is the holarchy. And when we now move into the formless and you're talking about God, you can talk to anyone who has a sacred narrative of any type, whether it's Hindus with Upanishads, or Buddhists with the teaching of Buddha, or Taoists with Lao Tzu, and instead of arguing over a narrative, we can move into trans-narrative space and we can start talking about what is the nature of that which is the source of all things. And now we're talking about aspects such as love and many other aspects that will help us grow together rather than divide us because we're defending a particular form. So God in the narrative is holarchy, and as we move all the way through, all the other players are simply holons. Now, let me say a couple of words about judges as related to David and the kingship, and then I'm going to move right on to prophets. So let me just say that judges preceded the kingship, and the point I would make about judges is this, that you must have a world of form in order to have judgment. And let's think about that a second. In other words, for me to judge, I need a thing to be in this form so I can judge it versus a thing in this form. And I need to see the otherness of what that is so I can then judge it. And that would be how I would have looked at you when I was especially in my 20s and I was believing that you needed to think a certain way, believe a certain thing, and do certain things, or you were going to be lost. And that's what I would have told you. Why? Because I'm necessarily a mean person? No, I'm not a mean person. At least I certainly didn't try to be. But it was because I truly believed that was what God wanted. And that also helps me today to remember when my ego starts to get engaged in discussions with people and I find myself getting more defensive, that I'm moving back toward that kind of me versus them thinking. So what's really happening here is that in consciousness, the judges were absolutely a critical part of history because judgment was going to become a big deal. And when Jesus says, "Judge not, that you be not judged," that's what he was talking about. Moving beyond religion, moving beyond boundary-driven thinking. It doesn't mean that we no longer use any judgment. Of course we use judgment. Of course there's law. Of course we have to get an attorney. Of course we have to decide how fast you can drive, or whether something is a felony or fraud, or we do contracts, which are law and government. Why do we use all that? We use it simply so we can function as a society or a collective. What don't we do? We don't use that form of thinking to determine whether this person is righteous or unrighteous, saved or lost. That then moves from role or function to trying to use it to determine someone's identity. And that's where the problems always lie. And that's what we're talking about as we go through integral theology that points to a different way of thinking. Let me wrap this particular section up by mentioning a few things about the prophets. The role of the prophets was absolutely within first tier, in that the prophets not only spoke to the people of Israel in that day and were always the dissenting voice about whether the king had done the right thing or not, or whether the people were being led astray in some form. But the word prophet always brings to mind the other aspect, and that is prophecy, meaning that the prophets also looked out into the future. And it was the prophets who introduced all the concepts that are later in the teachings of Jesus and the apostles. I already mentioned in a previous section how Peter stood up and said, "Hey, what's happening here at Pentecost? That was prophesied by our prophet Joel." When you get to the book of Revelation, and John's talking about a new heaven and a new earth, that wasn't new with John. That was taught originally by Isaiah. And Isaiah prophesied that at some point in the future there would be a new heaven and a new earth. And that brings us to the concept of determinism. What is its role? This is a big thing when we talk religiously, theologically, or in integral theory. Determinism can be a very dangerous proposition. What I mean by that is, we know that people have taken the view through time with regard to religion that God was very much involved and is involved in a deterministic process, meaning that you are already, when you enter the planet, determined, predetermined to be part of the saved or part of the lost. And everything, therefore, is in a deterministic role. Determinism in that fashion, then, can be very dangerous. But there's another way that determinism can be healthy because it leads from determinism to a formless second-tier state called co-creativity. But you must start with determinism in order to know how and the way in which you can become co-creative. Let's talk about that just for a second. If I look at just childhood development, I can go to any place on the planet and I will know, no matter what culture I'm in with the people, a 2-year-old is a 2-year-old. And there's developmental levels that are going to occur universally among kids. They're going to learn mobility-wise, intellectually, certain concepts, certain abilities, physically. They're going to be able to differentiate in certain ways as they grow from 3 to 4 to 5 and all the way on up. This relates to first tier, and that's why all of the levels in first tier with cultures, that's childhood single self identity. In cultures, you're talking the collective. These collectives, like Israel, they also are going from tribal to warrior to empires and so forth, and moving up in that way, in a deterministic way. In other words, cultural evolution has always happened that way. It's a social science. It's not a theory where sometimes it works that way and sometimes no. Sometimes cultures start modern, but then, they end up going from that to tribal. Centers of gravity always move in the same direction. And in that sense, then, evolution is deterministic. But that's not, in and of itself, its purpose. The purpose of this evolution is because these deterministic levels of growth are going to bring me to a place of second-tier consciousness where I become a co-creator with God. In the beginning, God created, and then God saw that everything was void and without form. And so for understanding, how did God have to deal with form? He had to separate it. The day from the night, the oceans from the land, Adam from him. You see, all of this is the development of form and the necessity of delineating it so that it could be understood on a certain level. Now, when we move from deterministic growth into co-creativity, what's happening is I now become a co-creator with the divine. It's up to me to understand through my spiritual consciousness how to address the situation of climate change, ecology, racial injustice, sex trafficking, whatever the violence is on the planet, whatever's causing the violence. It's up to me. Before, when I was in religion and you go back to a trajectory that sees God being in charge in determining the end of all things that's yet to come, and God is going to bring everything to the end, and we extend that thinking out before us, then what happens is I'm more likely to say, climate change, ecology, it's all in God's hands. In fact, it would be surprising for us to know how many presidents and how many people, even in political office today, hold some of those ideas. So instead, when we get to co-creativeness, there aren't laws about, Doug, you go do this or you go do that. Instead, I use all that I understand from history and from my own history, and I realize that I'm a co-creator with spirituality itself. And so I want a better planet for my kids. I want a better planet for my grandchildren. That means that I'm keenly interested in activism. I'm keenly interested in people that are bringing about a change. And when I find people that bring that kind of synergistic action, I don't walk up to them and ask them, by the way, what's your identity, before I decide to see if I want to help with this problem of eco or climate or discrimination. I need to know what your identity is before we can work on this together. No, because boundaries now get taken down, we're pulling together as a planet. And this is really the blessing of all the nations. See, this goes all the way back to the Abraham faith, spirituality itself. That thought is a pull us all together thought, bring us all into one big human family. We're no longer tribal families separated by rivers and mountains and oceans. We have grown, and now with internet and all the technologies that we have, we're like one big giant brain that's, connected together, and we are now able for the first time to pull together. The prophets foresaw that, and so they always pointed to an end, but it was the end of first tier. And in our next section, we're going to get into the end as it is described by Jesus in his teachings and the apostles, and we're going to specifically look at what did they say the end was, the end of what. So that's what we'll look at in our next section. One final thing I'll say about the prophets, and we'll wrap this particular section up today, and that is Ken Wilber's pointed out many times that there are not only levels or stages of growth for cultures, but that there have been people throughout time who have experienced states. So you have the stages that move up, but then there's states. States are transcendent experiences Perhaps it's a transcendent experience that involves a dream, a vision, a revelation. And someone has that, and it's beyond what is understood in that particular time. It is a transcendent experience. Well, the prophets are no different than all the others in history who have been a part of a sacred narrative of some sort and who have had some type of vision or some type of experience. Many of the prophets, for example, said, the word of the Lord came to me, saying. Well, they were having some kind of experience. Or you got people like Daniel. Daniel was having dreams. So you have people in dream states, you have people in some type of prayerful, meditative, visionary state, and that was true of the prophets, not unlike many others, again, in all the sacred narratives. But the point that Ken Wilber makes is this, and it's a good one that fits beautifully with the narrative. His point was, no matter what the transcendent state experience was, it will always be translated down into the level of consciousness of that time. It'll always be interpreted down. So, the narrative will say that the prophets saw as through a glass darkly. Why? Because even though they had these transcendent word of the Lord experiences and dreams, they could not see beyond the level where they were. They just knew something greater was coming, and it was always referred to as a mystery. In fact, Daniel is told in his vision, Daniel, all these things you see about an end coming for Israel, and you see the city being destroyed and the holy place and the temple being destroyed, these are things that are not going to happen for generations to come. You're going to go and sleep with the fathers. And Daniel was very troubled, as you can understand by this vision, because for him, without that external form, how in the world would there possibly be any identity? Wouldn't that necessarily mean that the identity of Israel and all humanity was lost? Well, when we get to Jesus, he'll refer back to Daniel, and he'll say, well, this is why it's happening now, and why Daniel couldn't understand it then. It was an evolution of consciousness. And so the prophets had transcendent experiences in my faith, in my belief, but it was always translated down into their particular culture in Israel at that particular time. The prophets also indicate that the biblical narrative itself is not based on a single revelation to a single person. Not criticizing narratives that have that, but I am saying on the powerful side of the narrative, you have many different prophets that existed and apostles in the work of Jesus, and it was over a long period of time, many centuries, from like 600 BC, 700 BC, all the way forward through centuries, when there wasn't any way to corroborate, there wasn't any way to collaborate, you had no way to email anyone, compare Word docs, and yet we see that all of this is just simply a spiritual consciousness recognition of all the levels as they were being experienced by all the other nations. So that's the setting. This whole thing is really providing us a setting for what I'm going to go into in my next section, and that is the transform part of the diagram, which is the work of Jesus, the apostles, and what's called the body of Christ, and why it was transformative and only for the first century, and how it moves humanity into a new heaven and earth, wherein we now ask the question, if there is no more church today, if there is no more Christianity today, then what is there? How does that work? And that's what we will move into next. So thank you for being with me again for this particular section. As always, you got any questions, please send us an email at info@presence.tv. I'll make every effort in future podcasts that I do to get to all the questions and do my best to answer. So thank you very much for that, and I hope you have a great day out there.